Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here today. We have a really wonderful webinar entitled Sea Otter Reintroductions, Honoring Balance and Relationality Along the Coast with some wonderful grad students who I'll introduce shortly. But firstly, I'll just give you a little summary of the Elakha Alliance for those who are not familiar. So we are a nonprofit here in Oregon, named after the Chinook Clatsop word for sea otter, Elakha. We were conceived informally in 1999 and by the late David Hatch, who was a Siletz tribal member. And his vision lives on through an amazing board and 2 full-time staff members, soon to be 4 coming up. So I like to say we're small, but we're making big waves in terms of sea otter reintroduction here on the coast. Our mission is to restore a healthy population of sea otters here on the Oregon coast in order to help make the Oregon marine ecosystem more robust and resilient. So if you see there on the screen, that's me scuba diving off of one of our marine reserves, Redfish Rocks, and you can see the holdfast that the bull kelp attaches to is partially eaten by sea urchins, which I'll talk about in a second, why we're focused on that critter. So currently we have a shifted ecosystem here on much of the Pacific coastline, and that's because we're missing 2 top key predators in the ecosystem, which is the sea otter and the sunflower sea star. So just a short brief history. What happened to the sea otter on much of the Pacific coast is that they were hunted for their fur starting in as early as 1760. And by 1840, most of the removals had happened. So the last known sea otter pelt traded in Oregon was in 1910. And then the second predator in the kelp forest ecosystem was the sunflower sea star. So while sea otters have been absent, the sunflower sea star was also eating sea urchins, which are prey for both those animals. But unfortunately, in 2013, 2015, there was something called the marine heat wave, the blob, that hit our coastline. And scientists think it triggered the sea star wasting disease. So basically, sea stars just started melting, which is just crazy to think about and horrible. And unfortunately, the sunflower sea star really hasn't rebounded yet as a species entirely. So unfortunately, this is what much of the kelp forest ecosystem looks like. It's what we like to call urchin barren. So just think of a blanket of purple urchins along the seafloor, and they're just consuming all the kelp because nothing is eating them. So that's a huge problem. And we think helping bring a keystone species back to the Oregon coast would be super helpful in cutting down that sea urchin population and allowing the kelp to flourish again and look something like this. And this is a beautiful photo from Monterey Bay of a kelp forest with some rockfish. And I do have a really healthy population of sea otters down there. So that's kind of our dream goal, is to have the Oregon coast look like this once again. I didn't even introduce myself. Sorry about that. Hi, I'm Chanel Hasten, Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance. And so since my job is outreach, of course, I'm going to plug all our outreach channels. If you don't already follow us and you really love sea otters and kelp forests and interesting scientific facts, please feel free to follow us. You can also visit our website. We have some incredible information about kelp and sea otters and climate change as well. You can also donate there if you'd like to, because we are a nonprofit and we depend on you to continue our wonderful work. Okay, next up, I'd like to introduce our speakers from the University of Washington School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. We started working with them, I think, just over a year ago on their research project, the Elakha Alliance. And so I'm pleased to introduce Isabel Jamerson, Danny Kosiba, and Olivia Horwedel. I'll pass it off to you all.
Great, thank you so much. We're honored to be here today, and thank you all for spending the evening with us. As Chanel said, I'm Isabel. I'm with my colleagues Danny and Olivia, and we're going to be presenting on our research about sea otter reintroductions in tandem with the Elakha Alliance. So next slide, please. Olivia, Danny, and I all entered the School for Marine and Environmental Affairs at the University of Washington in the fall of 2021 and decided that we wanted to work together on a required capstone project. We wanted to develop a project that utilized community-centered methods to advance Indigenous self-determination, and we hoped to better understand research methodologies that foster relationship building and expand beyond dominant Western scientific approaches to environmental management. These motives also led us to enroll in the American Indian and Indigenous Studies Capstone Certificate at the University of Washington. After sharing our goals with our community, we were introduced to the Elakha Alliance, actually by Jean Flemma, who worked with Bob Bailey many years ago when she was a student in our master's program as well. So we decided to work with the Alliance as our partner and developed a program over the course of our two years master's degree. Before we share more about this research, we wanted to make sure we cover some of the history. Chanel mentioned some of this, but we'll dive in a little bit more. Next slide, please. So as Chanel stated, European settlers were trading sea otter furs, causing disruption to many relationships between coastal peoples and communities on the coast. And highly sought after for their incredibly dense fur, colonists hunted 99% of the sea otter population from its original range. You can see here, this is included in the Elakha's ecological feasibility study, but their historical range is in gray, current range is in orange, and some of the remnant colonies are marked by the red stars. Next slide, please. Without sea otters, coastal ecosystems and communities suffered considerably. Chanel talked about this, that one of the major consequences of sea otters' absence was the decrease in kelp forests. And sea otters prey on urchins. However, after the fur trade, this urchin population rapidly grew and increased their consumption of kelp. And this shift in urchin populations ultimately reshaped a really crucial habitat for many coastal species and people. Next slide, please. So the practices and food systems of local coastal peoples also changed as sea otters disappeared from the coast. For some Indigenous communities, more abundant shellfish populations may have been a welcome increase as it supported people's diets and handicrafts. But at the same time, the lack of sea otters meant Indigenous peoples could no longer harvest sea otter pelts for ceremonial or crafting uses. Additionally, it meant that the spiritual and cultural relations with sea otters had been disrupted. And this is a relationship that had been nurtured for thousands of years. Next slide, please. So coastal communities felt this absence for many years until the start of sea otter reintroductions, which happened in the early 20th century when the United States and Canadian governments attempted to move otters from remaining stable populations in Alaska to what is present-day Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, and California. And as some of you may know, with varying success, some populations took hold and others dissipated soon after the initial relocation. But something we want to talk about today is that reintroductions at this time did not widely include the consideration of social and cultural impacts, and were mostly motivated by the opportunity to reestablish balanced ecosystems. They often lacked the necessary communication and collaboration with the Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples who lived at potential reintroduction locations. Next slide. So as Chanel introduced the Elakha Alliance, we were really intrigued by the Elakha Alliance's work to reintroduce sea otters to the Oregon coast by centering reintroductions in Indigenous histories and practices, therefore creating an opportunity to reestablish not only the ecological roles sea otters hold on the coast, but also to honor the cultural and spiritual kinship between otters and people. And this quote is found on the Elakha Alliance's website, and we think it illustrates the relations between the Alliance and the local Indigenous folks. So it says, one day, Elakha will once again swim along Oregon's shores. It is our duty, responsibility, and hope, as our ancestors would have it to be, to encourage and assist the work of the Elakha Alliance towards renewal. A renewal not only of old ways and old traditions, but towards a renewal of the necessary balance between human needs and the needs of the natural world upon which human life depends. So when we first read about the Elakha Alliance in the fall of 2021, they had just released their ecological feasibility study, and they'd also recently co-published an economic study that provided a detailed assessment of potential economic effects of sea otter reintroductions in coastal communities. And then in our initial meeting with them, we found out that they were also interested in how other reintroduction efforts along the Pacific coast address not only these ecological and economic feasibility, but also the cultural feasibility of reintroductions. So recognizing shared interests, the three of us and the Elakha Alliance began a collaborative capstone partnership in early 2022. Next slide, please. Then over the course of a couple of months, we conversed with them and developed a set of questions, methods, and deliverables that would help us better understand how past, present, and future reintroductions have influenced and could influence Indigenous sovereignty, food systems, and customs. So our goal was to support the Elakha Alliance's mission by amplifying Indigenous perspectives from along the Pacific coast, sharing the stories of the changing relations between peoples and otters in the coast, and offering opportunities for healing and restoration of deep cultural practices. We're very grateful for everyone who made this possible throughout the formulation of our project. And now Olivia and Danny will share more about our research process and findings.
Thank you, Isabel, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We really appreciate it. So as Isabel mentioned, I'm going to get a bit deeper into like the origins of our report as well as where our report is today. And so when we were first starting, we began with a literature review, which really helped us understand what kind of studies had been done and what has, what's out there as far as work with sea otter reintroductions. And we found that many of these previous studies looked at very site-specific locations, but didn't necessarily coalesce a lot of this information in one paper, which is kind of what inspired our report format today. And I'll demonstrate that a bit deeper in a couple slides. But in order for us to coalesce a lot of the information and stories and experiences of Indigenous communities along the Pacific coast, that required us to build relationships in order to have those conversations and be able to use that information in our report for the Elakha Alliance. And so there were two fundamental classes that we had taken through the American Indian and Indigenous Studies Department at the University of Washington, one of which was an Indigenous Research Methods course, and the other was an Indigenous Theories course, which not only provided us great support from our faculty and other students, but it also really helped us ground and provide a foundation for our work in Indigenous studies, first and foremost, before all of the ecological impacts. And so, as I said, we really wanted to build community through conversations. And so this map on the right shows our study regions of where we conducted interviews and had conversations. And so all the green areas represent geographies in which we had conversations from a diverse range of folks, from Indigenous harvesters all the way up in Alaska to U.S. Fish and Wildlife employees all the way down in Oregon and California. We decided to do a semi-structured interview format. And so last summer we started having conversations with folks, but we decided it would be best to have some structure in order to be able to compare experiences and ideas. And so we came up with a set of questions that we did ask all of our interviewees. And then we also allowed the conversations to expand beyond these sets of questions. And so the general format was understanding the past, present, and future for sea otter reintroductions in these specific areas. And so all of our conversations began with just introductions, and that varied widely depending on who we were talking to, as well as what that individual's relationship is with sea otters, as well as that person's community relationship with sea otters. If there had been reintroductions in the area where they lived, if so, how did it happen, and what were the impacts of these sea otter reintroductions? We were interested in the current management practices of sea otters, as well as what that individual thought was the most important thing for future sea otter reintroductions in order to center Indigenous governance. I'll get into some of the specifics of the conversations that we had, but we did notice a lot of common threads in a lot of the conversations that we held. And so I just wanted to summarize some of these because I think they really helped ground our report as well as provide a good foundation moving forward. One of the main things that came up in a lot of our interviews, especially those with Indigenous community members, were that there were previous relationships and understandings between otter peoples and human peoples that allowed them to coexist since time immemorial without disruptions to the ecosystem or the food system. However, colonization has disrupted these relationships tremendously. And so that is kind of where sea otter reintroductions emerge. And it's kind of a two-way street because in a sense, allowing sea otters to return to ecosystems where they once were, really allow for a lot of cultural revitalization, especially we've noticed that in Alaska, where there's the ability to harvest otters again. There's a lot of work in renewing handicrafts, and it also helps transmit the language and the processes of harvesting and conducting handicrafts and learning how to sew and tan hides. However, that's not the reality in all of the regions that we looked at. And also, even with sea otters present and cultural revitalization happening, if the ecosystem isn't in balance and a lot of communities are not able to harvest shellfish or other first foods that are really culturally significant, then that has been a real struggle. And so the goal with sea otter reintroductions that have already happened, as well as future ones, is to achieve ecosystem balance with sea otters being present through Indigenous governance and also ensuring that their cultural ecosystems are stable as well. And so on that green map, we showed our big total study region, but we've broken it up into 3 distinct regions for a couple reasons, some of which are because of ecosystem, political, and geographical boundaries. But also, we really wanted to honor and highlight the Indigenous communities that lived in each of these 3 regions. And so our other thought process for creating these regions was to hopefully highlight these Indigenous communities who have lived there since time immemorial and continue to live there, as well as decenter some of the settler place names. And so we'll start off with Alaska, since present day, what is known as present day Alaska, since that is our furthest north study region. And as Isabel mentioned, sea otter reintroductions began here in the 1960s and 70s, where a lot of sea otter populations were moved to Southeast Alaska. And it was actually quite successful, or deemed successful by ecologists, because populations really took off and started to boom. However, that obviously left a lot of imbalance within the ecosystem. Sea otters can actually eat about 25% of their body weight in their preferred foods, which unfortunately are shellfish for the folks that really rely or depend on shellfish as a staple in their diet. And so that really impacted a lot of the communities that live in Southeast Alaska tremendously. And in Alaska, another benefit, as I mentioned before, is that there is an amendment under the Marine Mammal Protection Act that allows Alaska Native communities to harvest. Unfortunately, that amendment only pertains to Alaska Natives who are 25% Native, deemed by the blood quantum regulations. And so while folks are able to harvest otters, it's not nearly as many folks who once harvested otters traditionally. And so that's one conflict that there has been seen in Southeast Alaska. Shellfish populations are starting to rebound as more otters are being harvested, and they're starting to strike that balance within the ecosystem, but there is a long way to go. There has been more co-management efforts adopted in Southeast Alaska, but that was not initially the case. And there was a lot of regulations from U.S. Fish and Wildlife as well, as far as enforcements and regulations on sea otter harvest. So it's been difficult to get to that place where folks in Alaska who identify as Alaska Native are able to harvest otters, to tan pelts and hides, and do handicrafts, since a lot of that requires funding, and that has been another conflict. So those were some of the prevalent themes that came up in those conversations with various folks, and we spoke to scholars as well as Haida and Sitka tribal members. And we wanted to share quotes as well from our interviews. We have a lot of great information that was provided to us and wonderful stories, and it would be hard to push that all into a 30-minute presentation. And so we wanted to highlight a couple quotes that we felt really exemplified each region. And so this was from one of our interviewees who is from Heidelberg, Alaska, and they are a Haida community member. And she says that colonization has played such a big role in disruption. As Indigenous people, we're trying really hard to get back to a normal life, a peaceful life. And while I think the people who started sea otter reintroductions had good intentions, they didn't think outside of their colonial world. They didn't look at every aspect and every outcome that would have happened or that could have happened from reintroducing sea otters to a place that has lived without them for, I think it was 150 or 200 years. Our second region is what is now known as present-day British Columbia, and it is highlighted in the green, as well as the communities who have lived there since time immemorial in our caption below. And British Columbia has a pretty unique history, I think, especially because most of the folks that we interviewed from this region are living and residing on Haida Gwaii, which I'm not sure if people can see my mouse, but it's the further northwest archipelago. And most of the sea otter reintroductions that transpired in present-day British Columbia happened on the west coast of Vancouver Island, which is the further southeast larger archipelago that kind of borders Washington state. And so since a lot of the sea otter reintroductions occurred off the west coast of Vancouver Island, there weren't too many impacts seen on Haida Gwaii for quite some time, and they're just now starting to notice the spillover effect from a lot of these otters, which is an interesting perspective when talking with them, because they're able to now proactively manage for that happening as they're starting to see more and more otters, as well as more pups, which means there are breeding populations that are starting to establish on the coast of Haida Gwaii. And so a lot of the management strategies have been collaborative, which has been really nice to see, and have set a really good model for future reintroduction efforts, in my opinion, with the Council of the Haida Nation working with Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada, as well as National Park Service and some other organizations up there. And I think because they've been so proactive, they're getting a good head start on it, but definitely starting to notice some impacts to shellfish. And so ways that they're trying to mitigate that is through using spatial management as well as Indigenous knowledge to kind of counteract some of the impacts seen from sea otters right off the get-go. And one of the quotes that we have from this region was from a Haida community member who lives on Haida Gwaii and also works for the Council of the Haida Nation. So he says, certainly in the last decade or two, we're starting to see otters consistently on island, and we didn't bring these things here. They're naturally coming back. We've never had any interest in purposely introducing them. It could be a polarizing topic depending on who you're talking to. Within the Haida community, I wouldn't say we're that polarized, but we're recognizing the balance between loving a sea otter coat or even a pillow and recognizing our traditional foods as well. And I will hand it over to Danny to talk about the rest of our regions as well as our analysis.
Thanks, Olivia, and thanks everyone for being here. I'll pick it up here with our third region, and our third region contains the coast of the contiguous lower 48. So what is now known as the states of Washington, Oregon, and California. One of the common themes for the majority of this area is that there's a huge section of coast. It's really hard to gather cohesive input from everyone who's here. Whether that's on local perspectives about how sea otters may be interacting, but also just like all of the ecological data for an area so large, because otters are behaving differently in each of these places. So luckily, we were able to speak to a variety of people, some state fish and wildlife employees, as well as federal government agencies, as well as some Indigenous folks and academics. One thing here that is not true for our region containing Alaska is that the Marine Mammal Protection Act is a huge limiting factor because people in these states don't have the same provision where they're allowed to harvest otters. So there's no room for cultural harvest and use of crafts through that or managing otter populations in that way. So that's one thing to keep in mind for a key difference. Within the state of Washington, a place where in each of these states, otters were reintroduced throughout the 60s all the way up through the 90s. There is the surviving population of otters out on the Washington coast. And we spoke to some folks and really learned that there is a lot of concern for both culturally and commercially important shellfish species out on the coast. And the issue being is that there hasn't been a large history of collaboration between both the states, the federal government, and the tribes on the coast. And there's a lot of concern for how otters are impacting these important food sources. And there's really a lot of desire for more work to be done there and to kind of improve some of the collaboration that hasn't been established yet. In California, you have obviously a much larger geographic area. Some of the ecological interactions there are a little less straightforward than the ones that we're come to be familiar with for sea otters. That classic organization that once there's more sea otters, you get more kelp forests. The otters there have a little bit different species dynamics when it comes to what they're predating on and how they're preying on things. And there's only one reintroduced population, and the rest are kind of more spread out along the coast. Again, it was really hard to get cohesive input on how people feel about otters here, but there's a really large public opinion that sea otters are great for ecotourism. They're cute, they're cuddly, but obviously there needs to be more comprehensive understanding of what people feel. I do believe there's also some impacts related to commercial fishing there as well. And then that brings us to what is now the state of Oregon. The state of Oregon obviously is where the Elakha Alliance is based. As we mentioned both before, otters were introduced here, but those populations did not last. But here you have this huge desire for this organization like the Elakha Alliance, who's coming in, working with and alongside tribes to honor these cultural perspectives and to do a sea otter reintroduction in a way that really hasn't been done before, really centering Indigenous leadership in those perspectives, making sure it's not just this ecologically focused project. So if you could switch slides, Liv. Next slide, please.
She might be frozen.
Oh, internet. Well, anyways, our next slide has a quote from one of our interviewees in the state of Oregon that they shared with us as well. So if you could switch over to that, Olivia.
Sorry, I'm trying to.
No worries.
It's not working. 1 second.
Aha. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see that. So this comes out of the state of Oregon, or no, just kidding. Maybe. And this really was a representative quote that we had from this area as well. So our society and our ways of life have undergone so many changes since the 19th century. We continue to rely on and uphold the animal abundance, the whole web of related species. It's hard to make it into an animal list or make it into a plant list necessarily, but we wouldn't weave baskets the way we do without knowing the landscape enough to pick hazel ticks at the right time of year, having the right conditions up on the ridge to grow bear grass. You can't rely on regalia for dances without the availability of woodpecker scarlet and red abalone and river otters, which are all different, beautiful things that come from our landscape that are a part of how we express ourselves. So that, again, is just some of the voices from people that we've been speaking to. So moving into how we organize these conversations that we had with people, we used a tool called Deduce, which is just a qualitative analysis software. Basically, that was a tool that allowed us to sift through all the conversations we had and really just pull out some of the major themes, recommendations, and stories that were shared among our interviewees. We realized that there's a lot of importance to keeping these stories in their total form and not pulling tiny bits and pieces out of people's life experiences, because they're really meaningful to the places that people come from and where they're at. But these are a lot of things that were repeated throughout our stories, and we were able to compare these dominant themes that came up a couple times to some different theories in Indigenous studies as well as ecological studies. So if you could switch to the next slide. So we were able to compile from all of these overlaps 9 different themes. There's lots of different nuance in these, but each of them could be something that's important to remember if the Elakha Alliance moves forward and is building these relationships with communities for a potential sea otter reintroduction. Storytelling was something that was brought up not just as a way to acknowledge the totality of people's life experiences in each of these locations, but also as an important methodology to really understand the full picture of what's going on in each location. Understanding what's important to each person in those places and how they're interacting with otters there, as well as the rest of the coast and other peoples, was something that certain locations are using as an important way to help craft better governance, different management schemes, and ways to just share with other locations how they could potentially learn from their personal experiences and apply it to otters where they're at. The themes of early engagement and relationship building are really intimately tied together with this idea that research and reintroductions from Western institutions like the government or academia, things like university and colleges, there's really a lot of distrust and harm and violence in the history of those interactions with Indigenous peoples and communities on the coast. And people feel like they've had a lot of these types of projects, like an otter reintroduction, brought to them, fully planned without any of their values reflected in it. So a lot of people spoke to the necessity to have to get there early and genuinely engage and build trust with people in these communities where otters might come back to. And then in that way, when you create a plan, you're going to end up with something that's really reflective of what people value there, whether it's different types of their jobs, their food systems, their families, and the list goes on and on and on. But each of those things are only learned about if you're really genuinely trying to engage with them in place, and you do that early and often. So building those relationships and acknowledging that there's a path to do a lot better and to heal some of these damaged relationships and distrust was really meaningful for a lot of different locations and how they moved forward and were able to heal some of the wrongs, as well as returning sea otters back to the coast. Restoration and revitalization was another theme that kind of lumped together these ideas of both ecology and culture. It's beyond just the ability of sea otters to kind of scope out this new habitat and return things like seagrass and kelp beds back to this blossoming ecosystem where you have excellent habitat for tons of other species. You have excellent fish amount for fisheries and industry, as well as really great recreation and all these other important things there. It's more than that. It's how people are involved in these ecosystems. It's how their culture is intimately related to these animals as potential kin species, and how it's just way more than the ecological, but also the cultural aspects that were important to people. So like Olivia said in Alaska, being able to renew some of the sea otter harvest, to be able to work with those pelts and to be able to have classes in community to sew sea otter pelts and work with that for important ceremonial garb, as well as just for practical things that they use in community every day. So you can revitalize some of those relationships culturally as well as ecologically, and acknowledge that as well. Prioritizing local Indigenous knowledge was another really key theme. And this really gets at the idea that Indigenous peoples have been on these coasts building these relationships since time immemorial. And there's really nothing that Western management knows in any comparison to that large amount of time that they've been living and working there. Things like the government for this country are not that old, and this type of knowledge about how to manage a sea otter reintroduction with something like an academic science or research mentality doesn't really get at all these relationships that people know and have lived in their communities for so long. So by prioritizing this, you open up a broader avenue to have multiple different approaches that can combine in really meaningful ways to have a more balanced project, to have a coast that's really more reflective of the reality that people are a part of those ecosystems there, and not just this separate part that occasionally interacts with the otters or the kelp or the fish. So that was something that was really meaningful, and I think is a huge key focal point for any introduction that might happen in Oregon as well. Collaboration and co-management, that gets at a ton of different things, but again, just being able to build trust and move forward collectively rather than separately was really important. Windows of opportunity gets at this idea that a lot of people brought up, that certain types of policies or economics and resources, sometimes they really just align in the right ways for you able to do this meaningful work, and you have to be able to seize that opportunity. Alongside that, supporting economic independence really gets at this idea that communities need support to be able to do these things themselves, whether that's money for hunting in communities in Alaska, or the money that they use to be able to provide staff to just monitor the otters, see what the otters are doing, come up with these plans, or even just to like conduct classes to educate people. That kind of support is really important for communities taking ownership of it and not having it be this overarching large organization outside of the community who's organizing everything. And then the last part that we talked about with a lot of people was modeling and monitoring. And that really just gets at this idea that you want thorough information about what's happening. Naturally, by bringing otters back, you're going to have a huge change that occurs in the ecosystem. It's going to shift how all the other interactions are going on. And you need to just pay attention to that, see what's happening, and to be able to suss out some of your options. If you go to the next slide. Well, anyways, so those were all the main themes that we talked about overall. And we really have this opportunity where a reintroduction that could happen in Oregon is a cool chance to be able to heal some of the damaged relationships between people and the coast, as well as protecting some of these other relationships that are there now, and they're really important. It's not just an ecological or a social or a cultural one, it's all of those things together, and you have to address these things meaningfully and in a plurality of different ways. All of these relationships will be different, they'll be shifted a little bit, they'll be new, it's going to be difficult, but it really needs to acknowledge that each of these systems are not separate, but they're very, very intimately intertwined. If a project like this moves forward in Oregon, people have really spoken to the idea that you can't just treat a reintroduction that might happen is something that's certainly going to happen. It's not a foregone conclusion if you don't consult with the community ahead of time, if you're not building those relationships, if you're not allowing them the choice while it's happening, because then you're not allowing them the right to just reflect their community values in a project like that. Things that they're concerned about might not be apparent, and sea otters can end up impacting really important parts of their life like they did in other places like Alaska or Washington. So our interviewees talked about a lot of the huge level of nuance here and the different ways that these types of projects manifest in really unique ways in different places. There's different management, there's different governance, there's different people and life experiences and cultural values that are really, really personal and they're context dependent to your place. But there's a lot to be learned from those stories that were shared with us from all these different locations. And people have been moving forward in a better way despite some of the history of past wrongs. It's not about doing one of these things, but multiple of them, using both Western science and Indigenous knowledges in these places. And there's an important window in Oregon where people are willing to do this differently and to do so in a way that's centering Indigenous leadership, embracing that humans are a part of ecosystems and not separate from them. So we'll just end on this quote here, which is also from the state of Oregon today, and one of the partners there, that I would hope that once there's a self-sustaining population of sea otters, they'll reach a threshold where they can take care of themselves and slowly expand their range, fill out this gap, and reestablish some kind of gene flow between new Oregon otters and California otters in an imperfect way to replicate the system that had always been in place for us. Thank you all for coming today. We are internally grateful and responsible for a lot of different stories and experiences here that were shared with us. We wouldn't have been able to do this without the support of people literally from California all the way up through now Alaska, and the wonderful support of the Elakha Alliance and the University of Washington as well. We hope that some of these stories were helpful and you're thinking about these complicated yet impossibly cute animals, and we're happy to take any questions from you now.
Amazing presentation. I'm so excited to see what you've been working on for the last, year plus. So that was really fascinating. Thank you so much. All right, we do have several questions for you. Let's see. Steve from the Mendocino Coast Sea Otter Reintroduction Alliance in California says hello. You can find him on Facebook for that group. Wondering what the most effective method of reintroduction is to new habitat. Is that orphaned individuals, wild relocation, etc.? And also, how does reintroduction interact with fish and crustacean fisheries? So if that is more of a question I should answer, you can throw it to me, but if you have any thoughts on it, go for it.
That sounds exactly like your feasibility study, Chanel. So by all means.
So Steve, the best method is a wild translocation. So taking individuals out of the wild and transporting them to a new spot. So that is what was highlighted in our feasibility study. And then we said, hopefully over time, we could implement surrogate raised pups into that population. But just having a population of surrogate raised pups is just not feasible because there's such a minimal amount of them. And also the only sea otters that are being raised as surrogate pups at the moment are those in California, and those are southern sea otters. And we are suggesting to take northern sea otters from Alaska, where 90% of the sea otter population lives. And so taking about 100 from that population wouldn't damage that ecosystem or that general population at all. But our hope is to get some southern surrogates over time into the Oregon population of the northern genetic subspecies, and then start that cross-genetic diversity that has been missing for over a century now. And to tag on the last question for that, how does reintroduction interact with fish and crustacean fisheries? So I can only speak on behalf of the Elakha Alliance, but we are we're an alliance. So it's not just us, obviously, as a stakeholder for reintroduction. And so we do interact with the Indigenous Crab Commission, the West Coast Seafood Processors Association, and various other fishing and crabbing entities to hear their concerns, have one-on-one meetings. So we have very open communications with those stakeholders as well. Let's see. Well, lots of questions. What is Elakha Alliance doing currently to build relationships and understanding with coastal tribal communities? Sorry, there's a lot of questions for me to answer, so I'll ask you guys a question in a second. Let's see. So the Elakha Alliance was founded by a Siletz tribal member, David Hatch. And so we have two Siletz tribal members on our board. We have the chief of the Confederated Tribes of Coos, Lower Umpqua, and Siuslaw Indians on our tribe, as well as the chief of the Coquel tribe. So it's very integrated in who we are and what we're doing. We also have letters of approval for our efforts from every coastal tribe in the state of Oregon. So we work with various other tribes as well. And we're constantly trying to do further projects and interactions with the tribes. We had tribal interns last summer they were both from the University of Oregon, and we created a tribal traveling display that we're going to just refresh some of that and get it back out traveling around the state. Okay, question for you all. What was the most surprising fact or thing for you all when you were doing this research project?
I can take a stab at that. I think one thing that I was not really clued into before we started talking with folks was thinking about how important it is to have, the exceptions in the Marine Mammal Protection Act to harvest sea otters and what that meant for Alaska, Southeast Alaska. Olivia mentioned that the blood quantum guidelines do put some limitations on who can harvest otters. But when thinking about, there was a big boom in population and the Indigenous folks were trying to, reestablish some balance with the shellfish populations they relied on. Fighting for the right to harvest those otters was a really essential piece of kind of reestablishing relations that had been there for a long time. And one of our interviewees talked about this, that they had this, understanding between the otters and the people, that they had certain boundaries, and that the shellfish in this area were specifically for the Indigenous folks, and they let the otters do their thing in another area. And that had been a relationship that they'd nurtured for thousands of years. And so thinking about how can we get back to that, the Marine Mammal Protection Act allowing that the exception allowed for harvest was really important. And so, thinking about what that means for Washington, Oregon, and California it's complicated and a little bit uncertain. And I think something that I was not aware of at the beginning. But the folks in Alaska have done an incredible job fighting, and proposing different rights and amendments to some of these federal regulations to honor the practices that they have had since time immemorial. So I think that was really important to listen to and hear about. And then, what kind of precedent could they be setting for other Indigenous tribes and First Nations around the Pacific coast? Olivia or Danny, do you have anything to add or different surprising factor?
I think that was a great surprising one.
Agreed. Yeah, I also, I guess, as far as like things that, were interesting to us or shocking, I think it was like interesting too to see the relations with like shellfish specifically along the coast and how that varies like community to community, because some of the communities that we talk to really appreciate their ability to harvest shellfish, as Isabel was saying, and yeah, it's definitely not less important in other places, but maybe it's less of like a culturally significant first food, or there are other foods in that area that make up a large portion of the diet. And so I think that, yeah, just the difference in opinions towards shellfish and like shellfish cultivation and shellfish harvest was something that I found really interesting, and how prominent it was specifically too in British Columbia and Alaska compared to the contiguous west coast of the US. It was definitely a different relationship.
Great, thank you. Okay, Bob Bailey has a question for you. What did you learn about the difference between how Indigenous communities in British Columbia and Southeast Alaska occupy their coastal environment, and how Indigenous communities in Oregon occupy their coastal environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of nuance in that question, because there are a variety of different communities that have established different practices in both of those regions. I kind of think what Olivia and I just answered, you know, like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and then also just relationship with shellfish. We saw pretty big differences along the coast, so within Southeast Alaska and British Columbia, and then in Oregon as well. So you know, while we didn't get to speak to everyone, I don't want to make any blanket statement, but I think that there are differences in kind of harvesting practices of shellfish that would then influence, you know, communities' response to reintroduction. And then also if they're able to harvest sea otters, that too, you know, pretty inherently changes what a reintroduction would look like for that community. Olivia, I don't know if you had something to add to that.
I was just going to say too, like with regards to reintroductions themselves, which I know the question is not specifically asking that, but I think one of the biggest nuances and like complexities in our project specifically was talking to communities who, like in Alaska and British Columbia, for example, didn't want sea otter reintroductions in the first place, although sea otters are a native species to that habitat and to that ecosystem. If it weren't for the initiation of these reintroductions from government agencies, I'm not sure if they would have happened or been initiated by Indigenous communities. And in Oregon with the Elakha Alliance, that's a big factor of what they're doing, is that this is an Indigenous-led, scientist-led, like a large effort led by a lot of different communities and managers and stakeholders and all sorts of folks. And so I think that was an interesting thing in trying to translate what we've been told and stories and conversations and interviews with folks further north, and how that could translate to the Elakha Alliance when a lot of their efforts are led by Indigenous communities. So I thought that was another like interesting thing, but also a nuance between the different regions that we looked at.
Courtney asks, what percentage or your best guess of your interviewees were excited about the prospect of sea otter reintroduction?
I think that's a hard one, because we spoke to a lot of people where the reintroductions already happened, like sometimes before they were born. I don't know, maybe like a sixth of people. So I guess another surprising thing is that, you know, we live sometimes on the West Coast and on cities in Washington and Oregon where we get a lot of the public discourse and outreach where people are really excited by the concept of ecotourism, and otters are really cute and cuddly. But it's really way more complicated than that, like we said before. And a lot of people are really just heavily impacted in a lot of negative ways. So there were a lot of people we spoke to who were not a fan of reintroductions and not a fan of otters in general. Which might be surprising. I know it was for me, just based off of, you know, what's maybe output in terms of like common Discovery Channel documentaries and stuff like that. But I think largely the people who are working on this project in Oregon and they're contributing to that, like people are excited because there's this opportunity to do it in a better way, having learned from kind of a laundry list of ways where it's gone really poorly and it's been imposed on people. So yeah, not an exact percentage, but there's definitely fewer people that are blatantly excited about it, but that's coastwide.
Yeah, and sorry, go ahead, Isabel.
Okay, I was just going to add to the interesting, like Danny said, it's interesting when they have already happened. I think the folks in Haida Gwaii are different in that they're kind of in this in-between where sea otters are starting to get there and they're kind of trying to jump ahead of the curve. And I would say, I mean, they're still collecting a lot of perspectives. They hold regularly community engagement meetings, and they're sharing their work all their time. And they're, you know, the collaborative governance structures they're implementing, I think, are really crucial. But I feel like people doing that work are excited that they are doing that work. It's yet to be seen what the management strategies will be, but they're engaged and they're taking the time to, you know, establish strong relationships. So whether or not that's excited about a reintroduction, they're at least very excited to be engaging in this work together. Yeah, just add a little bit more nuance of like some reintroductions are kind of happening naturally in that region.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add on to that, like if you were to ask people about reintroductions prior to them happening, I think a lot of people weren't excited, but because otters are now in their region and in their location, I think more of the lack of excitement was how the reintroductions happened, because a lot of people do have connections to these animals traditionally and historically and passed down through oral stories. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that there is excitement about, you know, the return of an ancestor and a relative and an animal within that ecosystem, but it's been done in a way that has not been inclusive or collaborative. And so I think that's where a lot of the anger and frustration around sea otter reintroductions in Oregon and British Columbia, or sorry, in Alaska and British Columbia come from. And now that they're already there, I think there is excitement as far as like working with pelts again and the opportunity to harvest and the opportunity to tan hides and all of these other things that come with having them there. It's just, how can it be done in a way that feels more reciprocal as opposed to it being forced onto communities?
Okay, thank you. Another question from Bradley. Have you seen any other interesting and successful collaborations between research institution and West Coast tribal communities?
I think, oh, go ahead, Olivia.
I was just going to say, I was, yeah, really excited to talk to so many people in Alaska and British Columbia because I feel like there's too many to even like specify. There's a lot of really wonderful things going on there. And of course, there's always more work that can be done, but I think both regions are really good examples of moving forward in a collaborative process between federal governments, state agencies, tribes, and then also a lot of them, tribes like have their own organizations, like Sea Alaska Heritage Institute is one really cool organization that one of the folks that we interviewed works for. And then we mentioned too in the presentation on Haida Gwaii with the reintroduction efforts there, there's a really unique collaboration between several different managing agencies. And so I think those are really good examples that people can look towards. But yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting things happening in both of those regions, which is, yeah, gives us a lot of hope.
Great. Okay, do you think sea otters could potentially be reintroduced to the Humboldt Coast, which is in Northern California? Do you all know anything about that when you were talking to people? Because I can answer that too.
I don't think that region came up necessarily for us. So yeah, Chanel, if you have any specifics, that's great.
So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service published a feasibility assessment on the reintroduction of sea otters in Northern California and Oregon. And they said, yes, it is feasible to do so. So there are discussions right now, besides Oregon, also in Northern California to reintroduce sea otters there. And actually, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service right now is planning some open houses for people to come learn about what sea otter reintroduction would look like, and also want to hear from the people about what's important for you to take into consideration. So I don't know if that information is publicly posted yet, but that should be happening at the end of June, I believe. So stay tuned for that. We'll get that information. And if you follow us on social media and join our newsletter, we will publish that once we get it. So yeah, there's an 800-mile gap from Washington to California where sea otters used to be. So bringing sea otters back to Oregon would help close that gap a little bit. And then if there is a reintroduction in Northern California and Oregon, that could help with the cross-genetic diversity as well. So that would be very positive. Okay. Let's see. Betsy asked, why did reintroduction fail in Oregon? So I'll touch on that real quick. So in the 1970s, there was a reintroduction of sea otters to, I believe, Washington, Oregon, and California, and I think Alaska, from saving a sea otter population that was about to be bombed by the US government for bomb testing. So these scientists had to work really quickly to grab as many as they could and translocate them. So I believe there was about 29 or so released in Cape Arago by Port Orford. And so we actually are going to be doing a presentation all about this translocation and why it failed. Thanks to Bob Bailey, our board president, who took a deep dive into gathering lots of photos and video history evidence from this whole translocation. But basically, scientists think that there wasn't enough sea otters released initially to withstand the natural mortality and immigration of the sea otters in that area. So after 10 years, that population just kind of vanished. So we have obviously learned a lot since the 1970s, and had the top 6 sea otter scientists work on our feasibility study on reintroduction here in Oregon specifically, and we have a whole chapter on translocation methods. So I suggest I can put that in the chat if you want to learn more about that. Yes. Okay. Want to be conscious of time. We've got 1 minute until 7 o'clock. So is there any final comments you all have on your research or any take-home messages you want or anything like that?
Yeah, thank you all for being here and listening in tonight. And I think Courtney's question might recommend checking out the work that's happening on Haida Gwaii between the Haida Nation and the Canadian government there, because I think they're offering a really cool path forward that might be ideal for Oregon coastal communities. But we're really honored to have worked with the Elakha Alliance, and I look forward to continuing our relationship with you all and supporting your efforts. Yeah, Olivia, Danny, any last words?
Thank you.
I have one little question for you all. What's next after you graduate in 2 weeks?
I don't have a good answer. Doing no schoolwork. That's my good answer.
No homework. Nice.
I'll be working for an organization called the Urban Ocean Lab. They are writing policy for coastal cities, and so I'll work with them through the end of the year and then figure out what's next.
That's great.
Yeah.
And I will be continuing being a student. I will be staying at UW and working towards a PhD in the geography department, hoping to continue weaving together marine mammal conservation, food systems, and Indigenous knowledge. So maybe some more otter work to come. We'll see.
Well, you know who to call.
Yes, exactly.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again so much, Danny, Isabel, Olivia. That was fantastic. We're very honored to be a part of your research project, and we wish you the best in your future endeavors.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining, everyone.